Rhea had learned from a very young age how to walk without making a sound. Not because anyone had taught her, but because in her Apache village, silence was the safest way to exist when you had no name, no acknowledged father, and no clear place in the clan's circle. She was 19, her dark skin weathered by the desert sun, her eyes sharp with the look of someone who watched more than she spoke. To many, Rhea was just a useful girl. Quick hands, strong back, obedient when needed. She lived in the main camp of the clan, beneath the shadow of Chief Van's authority, a man who ruled not only with ancient words but with modern fear. There, the fires burned every night. The elders told stories of the past, and the young were taught to respect the boundaries, even when those boundaries were twisted. Rhea didn't belong to Van's direct bloodline. She was the distant niece of Orson Thorne, an old leader whose name was barely spoken anymore. Only rumors and an uncomfortable memory remained of him, one nobody wanted to awaken. So Rhea grew up on the margins, close but never inside. That day, the sun beat heavily on the land when Rhea was sent to deliver water and dried hides to the council tent. Nothing unusual. She entered with her head low, as always, ready to drop off the bundles and leave unnoticed. But something stopped her. Inside were Van, his son Rhodes, and Creed Voss, the man in charge of guarding the clan's symbols, marks, and ancient maps, the keeper of the signs. A respected position, almost sacred. Or at least it had been. Rhea didn't know written laws, but she understood patterns. She had sewn for years, repeating gestures, and she could tell when something didn't fit. On the table lay a spread-out map, redrawn lines, altered markings, sacred symbols moved just a few fingers from their original place. Creed was pointing with his finger. "If we shift this point," he said in a low voice, "the spring falls within the new boundary." Rhea felt a knot in her stomach. That spring was ancient, sacred. It had never belonged to a single man. "No one will question it," Van replied. "The young don't remember, and the old no longer speak." Rhodes smiled. A calm, dangerous smile. Rhea took an unconscious step back. Her skin tingled. At that moment, Van looked up and saw her. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Silence dropped like a stone. Rhea set down the bundles, lowered her head, and left. She walked straight, without running, without looking back, but she felt the chief's eyes burning between her shoulder blades. That night, she didn't sleep. The words echoed in her mind. Boundaries, spring, no one will question it. She thought of the families forced to leave months ago, of the elders who murmured at night and fell silent by morning. 2 days later, Rhodes found her alone, cleaning utensils near the dry creek bed. "Rhea," he said gently, "they told me you were in the council tent." She didn't lift her eyes. "I brought what I was asked to." "Of course," he replied, stepping closer. "Sometimes, clan matters can confuse those who don't understand the weight of big decisions." Rhea gripped the wooden handle tighter. "I didn't see anything I wasn't supposed to." Rhodes smiled again. "I hope so. It'd be a shame if someone started thinking poorly of you. You know how tongues wag when a young woman walks alone." When he left, Rhea's hands were trembling. That same afternoon, as she gathered firewood near the horse pens, she heard voices behind a tent. "We can't allow risks," Rhodes was saying. "If she speaks, even a word—" "She won't," Creed replied. "She has no one." "Still," Van interrupted, "silence is ensured before it breaks." Rhea froze. It wasn't a warning. It was a sentence. That night she made a decision she couldn't take back. She packed the little she could carry, an old notebook where she sometimes drew symbols, a small knife, enough water for a few hours. Before leaving, She closed her eyes and memorized every line of the map she'd seen, every false mark. If she was going to run, she needed more than fear. She left when the moon was high, walked away without saying goodbye, without looking back. The desert stretched out before her, vast and merciless. Rhea didn't know how long she could last. She only knew one thing. Staying meant disappearing. And though she didn't know it yet, that step in the sand would change not only her fate, but the entire balance of the Apache clan. The desert shows no mercy, not to the brave, nor to the cowardly, not to those who run, nor to those who hide. Rhea learned that in flesh and bone when dawn caught her with cracked lips, blistered feet, and a throat turned to dry stone. She had no idea how many hours she'd been walking, nor if she was heading north or south. All she knew was that somewhere behind her, in that sea of sand and rock, someone from the clan would be tracking her steps. And ahead, there was nothing. No trees, no bird song, not even a merciful cloud. The sun had begun to climb when her legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, tried to get back up, but her body no longer listened. She clutched the notebook to her chest like armor. The symbols drawn inside, copies of the altered map, pieces of memory, offered no water, no shade, but they were all she had left. She was going to die alone. She knew it. She accepted it. And still, she didn't cry. She closed her eyes. Then she heard it, a dull, steady sound, like wood thudding against earth. Then a second, and a third. Hoofbeats. She tried to open her eyes, but the light was a blade. A shadow approached, a figure backlit by the sun. Someone dismounted. Worn boots crunched on the dust. Firm hands, not rough, touched her face. "You alive?" She couldn't answer. The man muttered something, not expecting a reply, and pressed a canteen to her lips. The water was warm, tasted like iron, but it felt like drinking liquid moonlight. Rhea drank desperately, then coughed, then drank again. Only then could she lift her gaze. The face before her wasn't Apache. It was the face of an outsider. Sun-browned skin, days-old beard, a look caught between a furrowed brow and quiet curiosity. He wore a tilted hat and a shirt that had once been white many storms ago. "You don't look like an outlaw," he said, not unkindly. "But you don't look like you're out for a stroll either." She didn't answer. She still wasn't sure any of it was real. He offered his hand. Trace Morven. She hesitated, then accepted his help, and trembling, stood. "Rhea." He didn't ask questions, didn't demand answers. He simply helped her onto the horse, holding her steady, like someone carrying a wounded animal. For hours they rode in silence. Rhea drifted in and out, lost between heat and exhaustion. When she finally woke fully, they were in a hidden ravine between rocks, where the sun couldn't reach directly, and a small campfire whispered warmth. Trace handed her a strip of dried meat. "Ain't no feast, but it keeps you standing." She ate slowly, then, at last, spoke. "They're looking for me. They want to kill me." He nodded, as if it were nothing new under the sky. "Figured. No one walks out here without leaving something behind. I left my clan." Trace didn't raise an eyebrow. "Why?" She looked down, hesitated. "Because I saw something I wasn't supposed to, and because I decided I couldn't stay silent." A long silence followed. "Then you did the right thing," he said. Rhea looked at him, puzzled. "You're not going to ask me what it was? If it's something worth knowing, you'll tell me. If not, that's your right too." That answer, so simple, disarmed her. No one in her world spoke that way. No one left room for silence. No one allowed someone to just be themselves. They spent the night in that nook of stone and fire. Rhea slept without jolting awake for the first time. Trace stayed up, slowly cleaning his knife, like a man who had spent years waiting for someone like her. At dawn, before they rode again, she turned to him. "Why did you help me?" Trace shrugged. "Because if you'd been on the horse and I was lying in the sand, I think you'd have given me water." Rhea didn't say a word, but inside her something opened. Small, slow, like a sprout pushing through dry cracks. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going alone anymore. The place was nothing more than a narrow gap between dry hills, where the wind whistled like an old wolf. But to Rhea, it felt like a refuge from another world. Trace dismounted calmly, helping her down. The horse, dark, with a white mark on its forehead, snorted as it stopped. She could barely stand, but her eyes lifted when she saw what was beyond the stones. A little girl. Small, thin, with tangled black hair and dirt on her knees. She crouched beside a cold fire pit, holding a stick like it was a spear. When she saw Rhea, she didn't move, just narrowed her eyes with caution. "Her name's Tiva," Trace murmured, removing his hat. "She doesn't speak much, but she sees more than anyone." The girl didn't say a word, not even when Rhea tried to offer a gentle smile. "Is she your daughter?" Rhea asked. Trace shook his head softly. "No. Found her after a raid, almost a year ago. Her mother—" He paused, dryly. "Didn't make it." Rhea asked no more. It wasn't the time. They spent the day in silence. Rhea rested on a rough blanket beneath a rock that offered some shade. Trace cooked something simple: beans, hard bread, hot water with salt. Tiva stayed close, watching every move the newcomer made, like she was measuring her soul. As the afternoon faded, Rhea pulled out her notebook. The pages were wrinkled with sweat and grit, but the symbols were still there. Circles, lines, crosses, dots. It wasn't a full map, just fragments of what she had seen inside the council tent. Trace came closer without intruding. "What's that?" "What cost me my home," she said quietly. "And maybe my life." She explained in a low voice. The sacred markings that Chief Van and Creed, the keeper of the maps, had altered. The new border slowly carved into place. The spring that no longer belonged to everyone, only to a chosen few. Trace listened without interrupting. When she finished, he let out a slow sigh. "I've seen men steal cattle, steal land, but steal symbols, that's different. That kills memory." "That's why I ran," Rhea whispered. "I can't let them rewrite it all like it never happened." Tiva came closer then, without saying a word, and sat beside Rhea. She looked at the notebook, then, with a thin finger, pointed at one of the symbols. "That one," she said in the faintest voice, "was the big tree." Rhea looked at her, surprised. "You know it?" Tiva nodded. "My mother took me there once. She said the water there chased away nightmares." Rhea swallowed hard. That place. The one they now wanted to steal. The sky turned crimson as the sun gave in. Trace lit a small fire. The heat brought a bit of life back to them. "You can stay the night," said the cowboy. "Tomorrow, we'll see." Rhea looked at him. "Do you have somewhere to go back to?" He shrugged. "Place doesn't matter much when no one's waiting there." She understood more than she cared to admit. Night brought the cold. Trace slept leaning against a rock, rifle within reach. Rhea curled up beside Tiva, wrapping the girl in a blanket. After a long moment, the child rested her head on Rhea's chest. It was the first time in days Rhea felt anything close to peace. She wasn't safe. She wasn't free. But she wasn't alone. And in the desert silence, while the embers pulsed like dying fireflies, she understood something. When a land is stolen, the first thing to disappear isn't the trees or the rivers. It's the story. And she was going to fight so hers wouldn't be buried. The next morning, Rhea woke with her face still warm from Tiva's breath, who remained asleep, bundled like a pup. The fire was out. Trace was already on his feet, chewing on a strip of dried meat, eyes on the horizon. "Today we head north," he said without turning. "There's someone who might help you." She sat up slowly. Her body ached like she'd been dragged behind a horse. But her soul was sharp. "Who?" "A woman. Name's Mabel Dobbs. Healer. Old, stubborn, and dangerous if you give her a reason. But she knows more than half your clan's council." Rhea raised an eyebrow. "And why would she help me?" "Because she hates lies," he replied, adjusting his hat. "And because she was once a friend to someone you don't remember, but who everyone else has tried to forget." The journey was long. They climbed hills, crossed dry creek beds, and passed through a sparse forest where silence weighed like lead. Tiva rode the horse. Rhea walked beside it, the notebook tucked safely against her chest. By dusk, they reached a clearing hidden among aspens. There, a crooked wooden cabin stood, surrounded by hanging herbs and animal bones. It smelled of smoke, sap, and thyme. Mabel sat on the porch, rolling tobacco with fingers twisted by age. She didn't flinch when she saw them. "I thought you were dead, Morven," she said without looking up. "Not yet, Mabel. But today I'm not here for me." The woman looked at them with an eye sharp as a knife's edge. Her thick white hair was tied back in a braid. She wore an old shawl with hand-stitched Apache patterns. "Who's this?" "Rhea," said Trace. Mabel stood slowly. She walked up to Rhea, looked her over close, as if reading her skin. "You're Lena Thorne's daughter." Rhea blinked. "How?" "You have your mother's eyes," Mabel murmured, "and that same way of clenching your jaw when you don't buy what you're being told." Rhea felt her throat tighten. "My mother died when I was a child, and before she died she left me this," said Mabel, stepping inside the cabin. She returned with a bundle wrapped in leather. She laid it on the porch table. Inside were papers, a birth record stamped with the clan symbol, and an old map with the original borders. "You're the granddaughter of Orson Thorne," Mabel said, "the last chief who believed the land belonged to everyone. They stripped him of power, silenced him, and then erased everything that remembered him. Even you." Rhea touched the map with trembling fingers. It was identical to the one she had seen altered. But this one had the right markings. The real ones. "So, does this mean "It means you have the right to speak," said Mabel. "And in times of lies, that's more dangerous than any weapon." Trace crossed his arms. "There's a sacred circle, a ceremony in 2 nights. The whole clan will be there." Mabel nodded slowly. "And if Rhea speaks there, in front of everyone, and shows this—" "She could corner Van," Trace finished. "Or spark a full-blown hunt," Mabel added. "Don't underestimate him. A man who forges maps won't hesitate to bloody his hands." Rhea closed her eyes. She had run out of fear. She had survived on instinct. But now she had a reason to go back. Mabel placed a hand on her shoulder. "Your grandfather fought so the humble voices wouldn't be buried. Are you willing to do the same?" Rhea nodded. I won't do it for him. I'll do it for me, and for Tiva, so she doesn't grow up thinking silence is the only way. That night, by the fire, Rhea redrew the map in her notebook. Not out of need, but out of memory. She knew something big was coming. Something that could break her, or save her. But for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She felt purpose. The night had left frost on the dry leaves. The air smelled of burnt wood and weighty decisions. Rhea woke before the others. She sat beside the cold fire, notebook on her lap, tracing the symbols she had drawn. They weren't just marks, they were tracks of a history someone wanted to bury. But she wasn't willing to be quiet anymore. Trace appeared, holding a pine branch in his hand, gathered from the nearby woods. Today, truth alone won't be enough, he said. We need someone willing to hear it. Rhea looked up. And who's going to listen to me if everyone's been taught to look away? Some look away out of fear, others because they were never given another choice. But there are still those who remember, Mabel said from the cabin, fastening her shawl. You just need to know where to find them. And that's what they did. That very day, the three of them set off toward a cluster of scattered settlements beyond the dry creek. They were makeshift shelters, canvas tents, old wood, and bone. There lived those who once spoke too loudly, those who refused to obey Van's counsel, or simply those who got in the way. The first was Brant Orley, a weathered healer who had once been part of the Elder Circle. Now he lived surrounded by goats and empty bottles. What do you want? He grunted as they arrived. Mabel spoke for all. We want to restore the voice they took from you. Brant spat on the ground. Voices don't mean a thing if no one hears them. Rhea stepped forward. What if I told you I have the original map? That I can prove our borders were forged? That they're using silence as a weapon? Brant looked at her with tired eyes, but not indifferent ones. Then you're more alive than they think, and that scares them. He handed Trace a scrap of parchment, stained by time. This was part of the old council's record. I can't give you more than this, and my presence at the circle. But sometimes that's enough. The next was Tom Rusk, a strong man with a back crossed by scars, and the look of someone who no longer believed in anything. I was the one who guarded your mother, Rhea. I was the one who stopped her from escaping when they wanted to silence her. And to this day, I haven't slept in peace. Rhea said nothing. She simply looked him in the eyes, and in that silence, Tom understood. If this is my chance to make something right, count me in. For 2 days, they walked forgotten trails, searched for cast-out women, young ones branded as rebels, old hunters who had lost more than just their land. Many didn't agree right away. Some asked for proof. Others just cried at the mention of Orson Thorne's name. When the sun dipped behind the mountains on the second day, Mabel made a count. We have at least 12 willing to speak, maybe more if others show up at the circle tomorrow. Trace looked at Rhea with seriousness. If you do this, if you speak in front of everyone, there's no turning back. I'm not looking for one, she said, no tremble in her voice. What if they try to silence you right there? Rhea moved closer to Tiva, who slept by the fire, hugging an old blanket. Then I'll speak louder. That night, no one slept much. Every spark from the fire felt like an omen, every noise in the trees, a threat. But in Rhea's chest, for the first time in a long while, there was no fear, only resolve. At dawn, with the first light bathing the woods, Mabel handed her a necklace braided with red and black beads. It was your mother's. She said one day you'd wear it when it was time to make yourself heard. Rhea placed it around her neck, closed her eyes, took a deep breath. The time has come. Days in the desert passed slowly, but that morning arrived like a storm held too long. The sacred circle was being prepared for the renewal ceremony, an event that gathered the whole clan, the wise, the strong, the ones who led, and the ones who obeyed. But this time, something different stirred in the air. Rhea rose before the sun. With steady hands, she braided her hair and put on the necklace Mabel had given her. In front of the cold fire, she stood still for a few minutes. She didn't pray. She didn't beg. She simply told herself there was no turning back. Trace watched from a distance. In his eyes was respect and a shadow of concern. "Today, you're not just exposing a lie," he said as he approached. "Today, you're stripping a man with power bare in front of his people, and that makes blades tremble." "Let them tremble," Rhea replied, "but let them not silence us." They set out before the first light. Mabel, Tiva, and Brant Orley walked beside them. Along the path, other figures joined, men and women who had been silenced. Some wore old necklaces, others carried forbidden symbols. What united them was the resolve written across their faces. As they neared the ceremonial clearing, the air grew heavy. Sage smoke, low chants, distant drums beat the rhythm of the day. Clan tents circled the great stone ring, and at the center, the ceremonial flame waited to be lit. Van, the chief, was already there. Standing, chest covered in coyote hide, and at his right, his son Rhodes, smile sharp as a dagger. To his left, Creed Voss, keeper of the signs, held a rolled-up piece of hide, the forged maps. Rhea felt a jolt at the sight. "They came prepared," Trace whispered. "So did we," said Mabel. "Don't be blinded by the costumes of power. The fire knows the truth when it's spoken without fear." When the main drum sounded 3 times, silence fell over all. Van raised his voice. "Today we celebrate the cycle that returns, the sun that never dies, and the wisdom of the old ones. But we must also cleanse the doubts that corrupt the heart of the tribe." Murmurs. Some knew what was coming, others didn't. But all felt something was about to break. "There are those who have returned with dark words," Van continued, "words meant to divide. But the tribe stays united under the truth we've protected." Rhea stepped forward. "Protected?" Her voice rang out clear. "Or locked away so no one dares question it?" The circle tensed. Some looked down. Others raised their chins. Van narrowed his eyes. "Rhea Thorne, you were welcomed by this tribe. Why now do you return your breath as poison?" She pulled the notebook from her chest, opened the pages, held them high. "This is not poison. It's memory. And I didn't come alone." Mabel stepped forward, then Brant, then Tom Rusk. One by one, former exiles, bearers of marks, of testimonies, of documents. Creed Voss turned pale. Rhea turned toward the gathered crowd. "This map," she said, "has been altered. Boundaries shifted. Sacred symbols moved to favor a few. The spring that once nourished all now has an owner. Is that the legacy we want?" A heavy silence fell. Only the crackle of the fire spoke. "I have the original right here," added Mabel, unrolling the old parchment for all to see. "Here is the proof." Rhodes stepped forward. "Lies. That paper came from an expelled witch. And where do you come from?" Tom Rusk cut in, staring straight at Creed. "I was there when you drew the new maps. I was ordered to stand guard, but today I refuse to keep quiet." A buzz of voices broke out among the crowd. Shouts, questions, whispers. The drums sounded again, calling for order. Van raised his arm. "Silence. No one else may speak until the elders have gathered. This act will not go without judgment." Rhea lowered her hand, but not her eyes. "Then let the judgment begin. But do not judge the one who speaks truth. Judge the one who buried it." And with those words, she laid her open notebook on the central stone, beside the fire. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't begged, but she had spoken. And the echo of her voice could no longer be undone. The fire of the ceremonial circle still burned, but its heat was no stronger than the silence that surrounded it. After Rhea's final word, no one moved. No one dared to be the first to speak, until an elder woman, eyes clouded by time, back bent by years, stepped forward. "I remember," she said. "The spring belonged to no one. We cared for it together, until they fenced it off, until they forced us to stay silent." The murmur erupted like thunder breaking loose. Eyes turned. An elder raised his cane. A young man clenched his fists. Women holding children whispered the forgotten names of their grandfathers. Van, still standing, tried to hold his power with squared shoulders. "This is not the place for trials. This is nothing but an attempt to destabilize our order, an attack on the clan from within." But it was too late for hollow speeches. Tom Rusk, steady, spoke from the outer edge of the circle. "I served your father, and the one before him. I did what I was told, until I realized that obedience isn't always honor. And today, for the first time in years, I sleep with a clean conscience." Brant Orley lifted the original parchment with trembling hands. "This document doesn't lie. It bears the old symbols, ours, and if Creed denies it, then let him swear it before the flame." The keeper of the signs, Creed Voss, turned pale. He lowered his gaze. Sweat darkened his forehead. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Rhodes, desperate, stepped forward, rage straining the veins in his neck. "What's wrong with you all? You'll believe an exiled bastard over the council?" "I'm no bastard," Rhea replied, firm. "I'm the granddaughter of Orson Thorne, daughter of a woman who died because she wouldn't kneel. And I've come back so her story won't be erased like you erased her grave." Mabel, from the edge of the circle, spoke with the calm of someone who's waited a lifetime for this moment. "Those who have nothing to fear have no need to silence others. If your power were clean, Rhodes, you wouldn't be trembling now." A council of 3 elders gathered beside the ceremonial stone. They spoke in low voices among themselves. Finally, one of them, the oldest, blind in one eye, stepped forward. "The clan has listened. The clan has spoken. Today, there will be no punishment, but no absolution either. An investigation will begin. The maps will be reviewed, and you, Rhea, will be allowed to present your truth before the full council at the next new moon." It wasn't a full victory, but it was a crack that hurt, and because of that, it was real. At the end of the ceremony, as people began to disperse, many approached Rhea, some in silence, placing a hand on her shoulder. Others with simple words. "Thank you. Now I understand. My grandfather used to say the same, but there were also those who walked away without looking back, and more than a few stared at her with quiet resentment." "You've turned the world upside down," Trace whispered as they walked back into the woods. "No," she said, eyes still fixed on the sky. "I just turned it so it could face the sun again." In the clearing, Tiva ran to her. She wrapped her arms around Rhea's legs without asking a thing, as if she already knew the seed had been planted, and that now it had to be protected. The clearing where they had camped was still humble. A circle of stones, a worn tarp tied between trees, and a campfire resisting the wind the best it could. But that morning, when she woke, Rhea saw it differently. Something had changed. Not in the landscape, but in her. She was no longer the fugitive hiding in the shadows. No longer the lone voice afraid to break the silence. Now, at least for a moment, she was someone who had spoken the truth and had been heard. Trace returned from the river, a bucket of water dripping between his boots. "Feels like a good day to start something," he said, nothing more. She didn't answer. But her expression said it all. They spent the day gathering branches, moving stones, clearing the area. Tiva helped where she could, collecting dry leaves, placing small flowers on the poles that marked the borders of what would be their home. "What if tomorrow they tell us we have to leave?" the girl asked at dusk. "Then we'll plant wherever we go," Rhea told her. "But for now, this is our ground." With help from Brant Orley and others who had stood by her, they built a small log shelter. It wasn't pretty, but it stood, and that was enough. Mabel brought seeds of corn and squash. Tiva learned to dig with a curved stick, while Trace showed Rhea how to cut wood without splitting the grain. Each gesture was small, but carried the weight of a new life. One afternoon, 2 older women arrived in silence. They brought cornmeal bread, a woven blanket, and a letter. "This belonged to your mother," one of them said, placing the blanket on Rhea's shoulders. "We kept it, because we knew one day you'd need it again." Rhea couldn't hold back the tears, not for the blanket, but for the recognition, for the place that finally was beginning to open. "Will you come for the new moon?" she asked. "We will, and we won't be few." The news of what had happened in the sacred circle spread across the land like water beneath the sand. Not everyone believed, but many began to doubt. And in that crack, Rhea saw hope. At night beside the fire, Trace told stories. Some were true, some weren't. Tiva listened wide-eyed, curled up in Rhea's lap. "And you?" the girl asked one night. "What story will you tell, Mama?" Rhea didn't answer right away. "I'll tell the story of a woman who spoke when she was supposed to stay silent. And because of that, she found out she wasn't alone." At the far edge of the clearing, a forgotten spring began to flow again after an unexpected rain. Mabel took it as a sign. Rhea took it as a promise. "This water is ours," she said, "not by possession, but by belonging." Trace stepped forward, set his hat on a stone, and dipped his hands into the spring. "Never thought I'd grow roots," he murmured. "No one ever does," Rhea replied, "until they realize they've stopped running." They remained like that, in silence, the 3 of them. The woman who had returned from exile, the man who had lived among ruins, and the child who had reminded them how to begin again. They needed nothing more than this. A place where the wind didn't push, where stories could be told without fear, where names weren't erased. A place that, for the first time in a long while, they could call home. The ground was damp from the night's rain. The air smelled of thyme and wet wood, and a ray of sunlight slipped through the trees like a silent signal. Everything was simple, but it carried weight, as if the old spirits were walking close. Rhea woke before anyone else, not from nerves, out of respect. She had washed her face with spring water, braided her hair in 2 strands, like her mother used to do. She wore a simple tunic, woven by kind hands, threaded with red and ochre. Around her neck, the beaded necklace Mabel had given her days earlier. "Today isn't about a ritual," she told herself, looking towards the hill. "It's about choosing, and being chosen." Trace was already waiting at the edge of the circle. He dressed as always, clean linen shirt, dark trousers, worn boots. But on his face, something was different. Not a wide smile, but a deep calm. Like a man who, after years of dust and loss, finally found solid ground beneath his feet. Members of the clan began to arrive, little by little. Some brought simple offerings, juniper branches, dried flowers, cornbread. Others just watched in silence, unsure whether they were there as witnesses, curious onlookers, or something more. Mabel lit the central fire. She did so slowly, whispering old words that not all understood, but everyone felt. The smoke rose straight to the sky. Tiva, wearing an embroidered skirt and her hair tied back with a red ribbon, walked up to Rhea and handed her 2 smooth stones. "One's for you, the other for him. So you don't forget that love, like land, must be tended." Rhea stroked her cheek. "Thank you, daughter." Tiva said nothing, but the word had been spoken, and there was no turning back. At the center of the circle, Rhea and Trace took each other's hands. There was no priest, no long speech, only Mabel's voice, steady and clear. You do not belong to one another. You walk beside one another. You choose each other, not out of duty, but desire. If one day love fades, let it fade with the same dignity with which you kindle it now. They both nodded. Rhea spoke first. "I don't promise perfection, but I do promise truth, and room for you to be yourself, without fear." Trace answered. "I don't promise I won't stumble, but I do promise that if you fall, I'll be beside you. And if I run, I'll run with you, not away from you." The crowd remained silent. And then, like a breeze with no warning, came the murmurs of approval. A few dry claps, a tear, a smile hidden for years. Afterward, they shared what they had. Bread, fruit, dried meat, sweet water. They laughed. They danced without music. And for the first time in a long while, the clan felt like this. A gathering of shared lives, not a structure of control. At dusk, Rhea and Trace returned to the clearing they now called home. Tiva ran ahead, barefoot, laughing with the freedom of one no longer afraid to lose everything. "Was that a wedding?" she asked as they sat near the fire. "That was our beginning," Rhea answered, resting her head on Trace's shoulder. He didn't speak. He just took her hand and held it. The moon rose slowly, as if knowing it had been invited. And beneath its light, in the midst of the forest and memory, 3 hearts beat to the same rhythm, not as orphans, not as strangers, but as family. The seasons passed like wind over the hills, asking no permission, leaving nothing unchanged. The clearing, where once there had been only stones and dry branches, now held the shape of a home. A simple wooden house, with a short porch, an oak bench, and smoke rising each morning from a shy chimney. The earth still cracked underfoot. But between the cracks, green shoots grew. Corn, squash, wild rosemary. Rhea moved with ease across the land, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady. Tiva ran between the rows with a braided rope, while Trace repaired the fence the wind had knocked down again. There were days of calm, others filled with uncertainty, but no longer days of fear. The new moon brought the promised judgment. The council listened. To Rhea, to Mabel, to the elders who had found their voices again. Creed Voss was removed. Rhodes disappeared. Van, faced with his own shadow, accepted his defeat without a word. The spring was returned to the clan. The original map was restored. And the name of Orson Thorne, at last, was no longer a forbidden whisper. History had shifted, not like a revolution, but like the rain. Slow, persistent, unstoppable. One cold morning, Rhea felt a change in her body. a different tremor. Deep, full. It was Mabel who confirmed it, with a gentle smile. "You're bringing a new life," she said, touching her belly with aged hands. "A life that will be born without having to run." Rhea didn't cry, but she pressed her lips together and sat staring at the fire for a long while. When she told Trace, he simply nodded. Then he knelt before her, rested his forehead against her belly, and said, "Thank you for bringing me with you, even when I didn't know where I was going." In the months that followed, the house filled with simple things: woven baskets, walnut shells, soft laughter. Tiva learned to read using the letters Rhea wrote to the baby, yet to be born. Trace built a cradle from walnut wood and a blanket stitched from old shirts. And one night, without noise or drama, under the light of a quiet moon, the child came into the world. Rhea held him to her chest. His skin smelled like fresh earth. His cry was small, but strong. Like her story. "We won't name him just yet," said Trace. "Let him find it on his own, like we did." Tiva hugged him in silence. She no longer feared losing what she loved, because she had learned that roots don't grow in borrowed ground, but in the hearts that choose to stay. The next morning, Rhea stepped onto the porch, the baby sleeping in her arms. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and chimney smoke rose in a straight line into a clean blue sky. She looked out far. She remembered the desert, the hunger, the first time she believed she would die alone. And she smiled. Because she had lived, because she had spoken, because, without raising her voice, she had changed an entire story. And you? If your truth cost everything you had, if saying it made your world tremble, would you stay quiet? If this story moved you, we invite you to join us in discovering more true stories from the Old West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us again to walk this wild, untamed land. Thank you.